Welcome, everyone. So hello and welcome to Fair Housing for Frome's Tiny Homes webinar to update and inform all former ticket holders on our Tiny Homes event of March 2020, which was canceled due to COVID. The news is we haven't gone away. We've taken the time during the last year to recommit to a tiny homes community in Frome, and we're here to tell you all about it. We also have 3 guests, actually 4, I believe, to feature in today's webinar, all working in the Southwest, who have developed their own housing solutions relating to low impact homes. They are Jackson Moulding of Bristol's Ecomotive and Snug Homes, James Shorten, who will introduce his business to you, and Rebecca Brewin and Neil Light, who are near Frome. I'm Prana Simon, and I'm volunteering today to help host our session. I'm a Totnes-based, fully accredited community-led housing advisor, helping a small tiny homes group in Exeter at the moment. And my keen interest in providing reliable information and training in tiny homes is leading me to create a website portal. And that's with the help of Dartington's School for Social Entrepreneurs. So for those less familiar, a very brief intro into Fair Housing for Frome. It has been operating since 2015 and is a CIC, that's a community interest company, with a mission of addressing the housing crisis in Frome in 3 ways: helping to alleviate homelessness, encouraging better use of existing housing, and enabling the creation of new homes to meet local needs. A new chair, Andy Jones, has just been elected, and he is passionate about making a positive impact for local people. Rory Supka, our first presenter, has been interested in tiny homes for several years and was part of a social enterprise course at Adventure relating to tiny homes in 2018, and joined Fair Housing for Frome in 2019 to set up this event, and has continued as a project worker. Polly Lamb follows on with the story and is the director whose work is in communications and project development. She's been with the organization since 2019. After their presentation, I'll introduce Jackson, James, and Rebecca and Neil. And finally, at the end, we'll have some time to participate in a Q&A and find out how their work is changing the housing conversation. When you're leaving the webinar today, look out for a follow-up survey. We will send you through Zoom and email. We'd like to find out what further support you might be interested in contributing to our project. We hope that the following hour will inspire your ideas and reflections. And I now hand over to Polly.
Oh, actually, it's me that's starting off for the moment. Thank you, Prana. So to start things off, what is a tiny house or a tiny home? Well, there isn't really a strict definition. In terms of size, it's typically referred to as an individual dwelling that is smaller than around 37 square meters or 400 square feet, which coincides with UK minimum space standards. The most popular approach generally to a tiny home is a custom built house built on a trailer, just like that large image that you can see there. However, and that really fundamentally changes the meaning of moving house. However, not all tiny homes are portable, and there are many different approaches and designs. I've sort of outlined a few here that are perhaps somewhat unconventional, but all are still technically tiny homes by those definitions. This global movement is primarily about returning to a simpler way of life. Through creative design and problem solving, people demonstrate that they can and they want to live with less space, less stuff, and a lower impact on the environment. We believe that tiny homes are a way to genuinely tackle our housing and environmental crisis in a small but significant way. So that's me for now. I'm just going to hand over to Polly, who will bring you up to speed on the story so far from Fair Housing for Frome.
Thanks, Rory. Hi, everybody. Welcome. As Prana said, I'm one of the volunteer directors for Fair Housing for Frome, and I'm also a project worker on the Tiny Homes project. So back before I joined, Fair Housing for Frome discovered that there was a really strong interest in Frome in tiny homes, and really wanted to explore the idea of developing a tiny homes community as a solution to the housing crisis. Alison Murdoch was a director at the time and a project worker, and she founded the project, and she was really the driving force. She detailed the group's vision in a funding bid, and Fair Housing for Frome received a grant from Community-Led Housing, the Groundworks project, to start it off. During the research that she was doing, the attraction to the project grew, and it was decided that an event would be a great way of converging all the experience from around the UK and to move the project on at a much faster rate. So a group of volunteers formed to put the event together for March 2020, some of whom are present today at this webinar. And the event had so much energy behind it, and all the tickets were allocated, which was great. So off to a really great start, but then COVID hit, and so the event was cancelled. So that would have been a year ago. And as so many normal aspects of life were affected, so was the way that Fair Housing for Frome worked and operated. And it took a while to get back on track. So the project has been knocked back by a long break from lockdown restrictions and changes of personnel and that kind of thing. But we've been working steadily in the background of the pandemic to reform and get back to the original remit of the funding, which was to launch a tiny homes community in Frome that answers a housing need in the area. So if you can see that, these are the goals of the project. We've got a timeline here as well. So we are in the process of applying for funding to maintain our project development. We also are actively recruiting future residents and supporters to help develop the project, and that's a big reason as to why we're here today. So really looking forward to seeing who's interested to join us. We want to identify suitable land opportunities for the development and to secure a site for the first project, hopefully by June 21. And then submit a planning application and build, say, something like 8 to 10 tiny homes, depending on the land, obviously, and a central multi-use community building. And we anticipate that being a 12-month build programme. So these are the goals that we're starting off, and we'll obviously adjust those as time goes by, but just so that you know, this is where we're starting from, and we can take you through in a little bit more detail now. I think back to Rory.
Thanks, Polly. So just to sort of bring you up to speed to what progress we've made so far. Firstly, we've been steadily building a good network of relevant contacts, and we're continuing to build and improve on that. I'll touch on a few of our most prominent contacts. There is the Tiny House Community Bristol, which are community benefit society set up by Rachel Butler. They've been working for a number of years now in the sort of preparation work that they've been doing, and they're really leading the way, I think, for tiny homes in the UK. They've been generous throughout in sharing information with us, and we aim to remain close collaborators. We're excitedly following their progress. They've recently secured their first site in Sea Mills in northwestern Bristol. So yeah, we're excited to keep following their progress. The next one to mention is the Frome Area Community Land Trust, also known as Faculty. They also originated from Fair Housing for Frome, just as we have, and their mission is to secure land for affordable homes for the people of Frome in perpetuity. So that means for forever. We hope to collaborate with them, but we're also aware that we have a lot more work to do still to really present a detailed vision of what we hope to achieve. We've got Jackson Moulding from Ecomotive in Bristol. He's been supporting us these last few months as our enabler. He'll be speaking a bit later in the webinar about his project Snug Homes and also about some of his first-hand experiences of tiny homes. Wessex Community Assets are an organisation that helps support community-led housing projects in the Southwest, including our own. They've got a lot of relevant knowledge and experience, some excellent webinars, and also a specific interest in tiny homes with their Raise the Roof project and also collaborating with Dorset Wood Hub. Also, Agile Homes founder Craig White was due to be one of our main speakers at our March event last year. They developed a housing solution called TAM, which is a very interesting and unique approach to small-scale housing. We also have James Shorten from Regenerative Settlement, or Terra Firma Geo. And he is a more recent contact of ours who will be helping us with planning advice and will be speaking a bit later in the webinar. There are lots of other people who have been supporting our project and continue to do so who aren't mentioned here. So it's a long list that hopefully we can share with you in more detail another time. So, and then in terms of outputs, in terms of things that we've been creating, there are a few things we've been working on. One of the most primary things we've been working on is a business plan. So Jackson Moulding, who I mentioned earlier, has been helping us in bringing together a document that outlines and defines almost all elements of our project. The aim is to have a document that we can use towards writing future funding applications and we can show to potential partners of the project. In order to build that comprehensive business plan, we've been researching a variety of topics. We still have a lot more research to do. We look forward to inviting people to join our team who can help with that research. Lastly, one of the other large outputs that we want to create is a conceptual site plan. We recognize the need for something visual to present to people, and it really helps us with refining our ideas as well. And I'll touch on that a bit later as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Polly now, who can tell you a bit more about how you can get involved with our project.
Thank you. So working from home is fine, and we've been developing slowly along with a small group, but it's really hard to connect with people in the way that we would like, obviously. We'd love to move the project on faster by growing the group, sharing the work and involving the eventual residents with each step of the process. We want the community to be a success, and there are different ways to make the vision a reality. So you can see this model that I've put together has got various ways to get involved. Fair Housing for Frome, it being the community interest company in yellow there, it's made up of a board of volunteer directors and a handful of paid people. And we see the tiny homes group remaining within Fair Housing for Frome because it has a wide established base of support, it's got an organised working structure, and it's got connections with other groups like Frome Area Community Land Trust that Rory just mentioned. At some point, a tiny homes group may need to form its own legal entity, but for now we have a really good level of support. So if you see yourself in that blue section, Tiny Homes Frome membership, you could be an informal member of a group that you can contribute in some way, and we can show you that in a moment. You may be able to offer skills, time, land. You might actually want to live on the site. So you could be part of that group, but you could also be in green there, a future resident of the site once it's completed. And all your work would be working towards the eventual community that you live in. We also understand that there's a wider group of supporters who have their own projects but may be able to contribute building advice, financial help, land again, land, we're always looking for land, training, or any kind of support, investment. So the model's there to show you different ways that you could get involved. If you're looking to get involved with Fair Housing for Frome, you can apply to become a director. Not sure how many people are being taken on, but those are the levels there. We aim to do an informal soft membership for that blue Tiny Homes Frome membership area and move on to develop future residents. So this is the way that we envisage growing the group, splitting off into working groups. Rachel Butler from the Tiny Homes community in Bristol that Rory was just talking about, she's been an inspiration to tiny homes groups across the country, and she certainly inspired us with a generous sharing of ideas and progress, and particularly the work that Bristol has done to organise and develop the community, involving all the members and allowing the work to be shared and pushed forwards in a really positive way. So that everybody feels that they're involved with the eventual community. So this is how the start of Tiny Homes Frome group can divide the work to move the project forward, feeding in and out of maybe a core group. But if you see yourself being able to contribute to any one of those areas, we've got a suggested list of tasks and roles. And all of these are in the survey that Prana was talking about before. So when you finish this webinar, you'll be able to see a survey in the browser, and it will also get emailed to you in a couple of days. So we really look forward to getting some feedback about how you might want to get involved. One of the things that we'd really like to develop early on is a charter. We want to do that with the help of the group so that everybody is involved in moving ideals forward. But what I think we're wanting to stress today is that we have a set of core standards, so that we can, if you think that these sort of fit with you and how you imagine a tiny homes community being, then coming on board and developing under these three sorts of headings: sustainability, community, and economy, would be the aims of the group. So with sustainability, we're very certain that many people getting involved with tiny homes are also interested in sustainability, eco-build standards, permaculture, renewable energy, low impact living. With a community element, we're looking at things like co-housing, sociocracy, which we would be obviously defining more clearly some of these in a working group scenario. But we're talking about coming together to make decisions. We're also really keen to involve whatever final community we put together, being involved with the local surroundings and the local Frome area. I think that's really important. And the economy, we're looking at affordable or fair rent models that we can land on eventually, that will make it really accessible to people and truly answer a housing need. Things like co-working and food growing are really important as well. So that gives you sort of a rundown of how we would like to develop the community with the help of whoever comes on board. Back to Rory.
Thanks very much, Polly. So this is our conceptual site plan. I sort of touched on the fact that we were creating one earlier. It's a little rough around the edges, but it's a starting point for our discussion. So the intent is that this will evolve and become more detailed over time as we sort of deepen our research and discuss things as a group, or discuss things in working groups. It will also inevitably have to adapt to specific pieces of land. But we have to start somewhere with something conceptual, and we're also in some ways following in the footsteps of the Tiny House Community Bristol in that regard. The core principles behind this conceptual site plan at the moment that will guide its future development are as follows. So we would like to have a mixed tenure of pre-built dwellings and self-build plots. So people who want to build their own home, either assisted or entirely on their own, that they can bring that home to site, and then pre-built dwellings where people don't necessarily want to be involved in the build process but would like to live in a tiny home. So another important aspect is communal outdoor space, including areas for growing food. we'd like to have an exceptionally low environmental impact if we can, through the use of carbon capturing, recycled and reclaimed materials where possible, renewable energy production, rainwater collection, filtration and recycling, and other sustainable practices. That's just to name a few. Would also be important for us to have a communal building with shared adaptable space for socializing, working and holding events, and also sort of shared laundry and other and kitchen and other facilities. That's just to sort of give you an idea of what's been guiding this conceptual site plan, but it will continue to evolve. The idea is that this community would not be separate from the community of Frome, but a positive addition to it. We'd want to give people the opportunity to come and use the communal building, even if they aren't part of the community itself, a part of this community. So, and also parts of the outdoor space as well. We really look forward to receiving input from new members, inviting them to contribute their skills to improving this conceptual site plan and giving their feedback. So that's all for the conceptual site plan. I'm now going to hand over to Prana, who's going to introduce our first guest speaker, Jackson Moulding.
That was great, Rory and Polly. Thank you both. We are now hearing from you, Jackson. You've been a housing enabler for Fair Housing for Frome. You're in Bristol, based in Bristol, and you also have a company called Snug Homes, which is all about a new kind of modular home. So over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Prana. Thank you team as well. It's been fantastic working with the Frome crew. Yes, I do live in Bristol, and I did grow up around Frome, so Frome's my old stomping ground. So it's really exciting to see such a great project come forward, and there's been a huge amount of work by Polly and Rory and Ali and Alison in setting up this side of things as part of Fair Housing for Frome. So my background is 20 years ago, I was involved in helping as part of a community group set up this housing scheme in Bristol. It's not a tiny house scheme, but what it did do is bring together the ideas around self-build and community, lots of the things that that want to be addressed, I think, through the drive for a community tiny house scheme. And through this project and the benefits that I saw both in myself, my family, and also the other people around me, were that we need to really rethink how we deliver housing, and we need to rethink how people are involved in the process of delivering housing. And more often than not, as we'll see, there's most housing developments are very commercially based and profit driven. And so actually, if collectively we can change that, then that's a good thing and move towards more community based objectives. So that led through to us setting up an organisation called Ecomotive, as Prana mentioned, and really to try and unblock some of the hurdles. We had lots of people that kept approaching our project and saying, we're really interested in what you've done here, how can we do something similar? So we started working with groups. We also found that there were bigger blockages than just groups not really knowing what to do, but also around policy, around obtaining land. So over the last, I guess, 15 years, we've been supporting in other, setting up other organisations. So NAXPA has done lots of stuff on policy and supporting self-build, and also around helping to set up the Bristol Community Land Trust, which is trying to take land into ownership by community, as well as various projects such as the local self-build register and Snug Homes, which I'll talk about in a moment. But one of the big things that we kept coming back to was that, as I'm sure some of you will have questions about, which is land price and how do you get a project going, and how can you justify the cost of a big building when lots of people are just trying to find a way to get out of sort of maybe a tricky sort of private rented situation. And we kept going back to the idea around tiny homes and the idea around that. So I guess probably around 2012, started exploring tiny houses for Bristol, whether that would be possible. We got quite a strong reaction from the council. They weren't, the problem is because they don't meet space standards, they don't allow the council to get people off of the housing list in an official way. And so they weren't particularly interested in it. But we were still keen to say, well, how can we, what is it about small homes that work? And we thought, well, maybe let's try and design something up that might be good. And we played around this idea, I think, back in 2013, 14, as a little sort of allotment style kind of small building that could be built as a modular thing. There's so many different designs and ideas. Don't worry about reading all that information. It's just, and this was actually a competition we submitted this for back then. But it led us down into a bit of research, and I started exploring different projects around the world. And this is from sort of very smallest end of the scale, I guess. We've got this is a homeless village in Portland in the USA, where a bunch of people were living under a bridge, and they got supported to help build their own little places. And it's given these people a huge amount of dignity around the place they live, which is why they've got that name. And then there's what Rory touched on earlier, the idea around self-build, touching people being able to build their own places. These are some homes from Vancouver Island and down in Seattle. And then right across into all around the world, people are trying to find housing solutions. So in Kumamoto, this little eco village, there's these little sort of slightly larger than shed little homes that a number of people live in on this project. And then this is an interesting one in Detroit, which Cass Community Housing delivered a sort of a throwback to neoclassical, I guess, Greek revival style, but still a tiny house in the region of 20 to 30 square meters. This is fantastic because they allow someone who's homeless to live in it, and if they pay their rent, and they can, not the rent, they can pay their bills over a 3-year period, then they get to keep the home. And the idea is of end user involvement. We were involved in the Bristol Community Land Trust inaugural project, which was a self-finish scheme where all the residents helped to complete their homes. And that empowerment of being involved, it was really incredible. And it's something that's led us on to how could we marry up the ideas of tiny houses and the idea around completing, being hands-on. So we thought if we could have a sort of a pop-up factory space where we had training and production all in the same place and skilling up, then that's what we've strived to do. And we came up with a little design. There's lots of designs around small homes. That the throwback to the council saying they didn't want to have tiny homes, we thought, well, there's so many hurdles. Let's try do a small building to start with. So we aimed for 37 square meters. This design is actually 44 square meters, but it's over 2 floors, which throws up a whole myriad of issues around planning, which we can talk another time about. Don't have time now. So we thought, well, let's start building that. So we set up this pop-up factory. It was fantastic. We've got some Innovate UK funding to do lots of research around how we could make it modular and how we could test some of the modular aspects. So how we could build a frame that was super eco, super insulated using really nice materials. This is a bit of insulation at the bottom in the fabric, which was made from old denim jeans. And then we moved the modules to site, a little like you could move a tiny house, though not on wheels, but as modules. So 4 modules made that home. And that was the completed house that we finished about 2 weeks ago. And someone's moved in through the council housing programme, and they've got now a very super energy efficient home. And part of the story, we also want to play around with colours, and we also around the Sustainable Development Goals, which are incredibly important now, more important than they've ever been. And we've coloured in the back cladding for each of the cladding panels with one of the colours from each Sustainable Development Goals. So if you ever get to have a look at it, you can go and find your favourite goal and find your colour. There's just a picture inside, just to finish up. And I just want to say that now, we've got a climate emergency on our hands, if you're to believe what lots of people are talking about. And that's going to lead into an economic, social, and more ecological emergencies. And we really need to change what we're doing. And I think the project that these guys in Frome are pushing towards around re-looking at how we deliver housing is critical now, more critical than it's ever been. So I'm just going to stop the share and take you back to Prana. So yeah, thank you guys for let me show a few little bits and pieces.
Thank you very much, Jackson. We're gonna hear from James Shorten of Terra Perma Geo now. He's a planning and eco-build consultant focusing on low carbon development. And he's from Totnes area. So James, tell us more.
Hi, just to be clear, also regenerative settlement is my reworking of the Welsh One Planet development scheme to take it through into the regenerative paradigm and hopefully into England. So that's why you also heard that term today. I wrote most of the One Planet development guidance for the Welsh Assembly Government back in 2011. Yeah, I'm a planner. I've worked as an academic, worked for local authorities, and I have my own company. And I've worked on alternative housing and rural housing for a long time. And currently we're working with several groups down here in Totnes towards forming small communities. Yeah, and also I live in an intentional community of 55 adults and children, and I currently live in 32 square meters. So I'm living that particular experience and like it. My task today is give you an overview of planning matters as they intersect with this whole agenda. The background here is that effectively we have a failure of affordable housing that's stretched back for at least 3 decades and coincides with the sale of the council houses pretty much. We have a lack of strong policy to deliver affordable housing. We have unfavourable viability arrangements that favour developers, and we have a lack of grants. And therefore we have an enormous backlog of affordable housing of all types, but including small units. The planning system is also very conservative. It's resistant to change and new ideas, as Jackson outlined. Be reasonable to say they struggle to get their heads around things like tiny homes. And there's also, we need to understand in the context of this conversation, there's a big difference between rural and urban. The basic answer in rural areas for new houses is no unless, whereas in urban areas it's yes, but what sort? So the challenge in rural areas is often very much higher. And there's a detail around that we may get into later. I want to briefly look at the idea of what a tiny homes community might be in planning terms. There is no convenient pigeonhole for this. It's also strongly dependent on location, as I said. In an urban area, it could be seen as in principle acceptable, but in rural areas, unless it's housing local people, it would be likely to be seen as unacceptable unless there's a significant justification for it. The issue here is tiny homes in themselves have this notion of mobility and flexibility, whereas giving planning permission for houses is about giving permanent consents for buildings, basically. And I want to talk briefly, therefore, about caravans. Caravans are an odd thing in law. There's 3 tests defining a caravan in UK law. The size test, it must be no more than, and wait for it if you don't know this yet, 20 meters by 6.8 in length and width by 3.05 meters internal height. So caravans can be enormous. And that's partly to facilitate the swapping on and off of caravans on holiday parks. But they are also very useful entities because planners understand what they are. And they understand what caravan sites are, and caravan sites have a particularly accommodated space within planning law. Therefore, one way to look at tiny homes is to regard them as caravans. And that will create a lot easier path for planners to engage with them. But as Rory's slide showed, you often hit the height issue, which is tiny home developers like to make them more than 3 meters internal height to put in sleeping lofts. Another way to look at tiny homes is co-housing, which is much less well understood by planners, but is still reasonably well understood. The notion that you have a smaller house in exchange for being part of shared facilities, the common house, which will typically involve a kitchen and a dining room and possibly a laundry, and also shared garden and growing space. So that's another reference point we might be able to use to make a tiny home development seem more like something the system is more used to. But ultimately, there is a task here to explain what is an alternative form of housing in itself, but then to link it back to familiar enough reference points. But the danger of linking it to housing, as we've touched on already, is you hit the housing space standards. Because just for example, should a local authority start giving consent for smaller than space standard dwellings on a tiny home site, then arguably developers would also seek to be allowed those similar small or too small homes on their sites. So that's the catch that local authorities are very conscious of. Yeah, so in a rural area, as I said, arguably there's more potential for the sorts of development we have seen a photo of in terms of the schematic site plan, where you might want to link a tiny home development to growing food, access to more land and so on. But the challenge in a rural area is much more significant because of what's called a presumption presumption against development, sorry, in the open countryside. So overall, I think my recommendation to a tiny home community that was forming for now, and I've discussed this with a planning lawyer colleague who was also kind enough to share his thoughts, is to work with the caravan model, because they're known quantities. Caravans don't have to have wheels in law and so on, but the benefit of the caravan model is twofold. It's familiar. There's a whole consenting regime around caravan sites that already expects there to be common facilities, but also to give planners some comfort. If things don't work out for a particular site, caravans are by definition movable, and so things can be moved on. And given that we are dealing with, I think the principal challenge at the moment from a planning perspective is to shape a tiny house development into something that feels familiar and acceptable enough so that it won't be too hard to understand what it is. My recommendation would strongly be to work with caravans as a model which is familiar and is probably near enough to a tiny home in most people's minds. And as I said, cabins are basically caravans. Caravans can be built on site. There's no, the definition of caravan is basically very broad. Another thing I wanted to quickly mention was the importance of whole site management plans. I think it's very easy to get sucked into consideration of a particular tiny home, what a particular person might want to purchase or build. But from a planning perspective, I'd say it's as important to understand how the whole site works together. And there can be some advantages in that. You know, we now in planning world are interested in seeing biodiversity net gains on particular sites. The ability to meet certain residents' needs from the site, such as from PV and solar energy or food, is relevant to planning considerations for a site as a whole. But there needs to be something that enshrines that in terms of how the site as a whole is actually going to work. So as well as thinking about individual tiny homes, thinking about what a community is and what the sort of shared features and how that can be best represented to planners. Also in my working with groups, it's really important, and this is also from the experience of living in a community, to have agreements and understandings from residents about what the whole thing's about and what is expected from individuals and so on. Yeah, so I'm happy to wrap up there. I know we've got some questions lined up, but I expect, Prana, you want me to leave them, even though some of them have been asked in advance, until the Q&A session.
That's right. Yes, thank you.
Great.
Yeah, and you're in good time. Thank you for compressing things. So we're on to Rebecca and Neil, who are our last presenters. Hang on. So this is an active tiny self-refurb near Frome. Neil Light is doing this for Rebecca Brewin, who is a teacher, artist, and writer. And she is going to share her journey to making tiny living a reality for herself. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for what's been said so far and for being invited to be part of this. I've been dipping in and out of being involved in the tiny home group over the last year or so, and then sort of set out on this kind of endeavour. And so the idea of this is to talk a little bit about that journey, and to talk about how I came to be the owner of a tiny home. And then Neil's going to say something about the kind of building aspect of it, being the builder and designer of it. And then maybe just to kind of bring people up to date with where it is at the moment, so where we've got to on that journey. So I think one thing that I felt James brought up, which is interesting to me, is how you kind of set out on something like this, where you have a kind of ideal about something that's movable and kind of flexible and tiny and simple, and actually the context in which that is happening is kind of the opposite of that. It's somehow static, full of rules, and complicated. So that is one of the kind of paradoxes or tensions that I think has been part of the learning of this journey. But anyway, what happened was I think I arrived in Frome probably somewhere around 8 years ago, and got invited to, I don't even know what it was. I think it was an environmental building sort of event that was going on, and I went over to a farm in a place just outside Frome, and got to see the kind of model that someone I didn't yet know then had started, which was the kind of essential structure of a shepherd's hut, or what we now call the kind of shepherd's wagon. And that person, I believe, is in the audience. I can't see anyone. So Paul Horton was the sort of initial maker and designer of the kind of structure that I ended up buying and inheriting. I can't see the slides either, so I think you can probably see how it was to begin with. It was yeah, there we go. So there was the essential structure, the chassis, which Paul amazingly had designed and built himself, and then, I mean, it looks fairly roughshod, but incredibly intricate design. And after doing a lot of research, I think another thing that James sort of mentioned was that you can buy these shepherd's huts that have got great big iron wheels and blah blah blah, but they have to be put on a low loader in order to move them. The incredible thing about this design was that it's large, but it's essentially a wooden caravan and can be towed by a Land Rover. So that was the attraction to buying this particular thing. And thank you to Paul for all the amazing work that he did to kind of initiate it. It took vision and blood, sweat and tears. I know that. Yeah, the second image there is how we kind of started, which was to kind of put weatherproof the outside and put on the roof. So that's Neil there, and I'm just going to hand over to him now to say a little bit about the process of the. Yeah.
Hi. So I should say, in some respects, it doesn't feel like my tribe today. But then I think back, actually, I had a phase of my life. I studied design and engineering a long, long time ago. And I was really interested in ecologies and sustainable living and small homes and architecture. I kind of left that world behind in a way. So at the moment, my mind is racing in all the things which people are talking about. So I met Rebecca about 3 years ago at a community, a Christian community, meditation retreat, which was sort of being built. I did some work there. So I got to know Rebecca's idea for living in a kind of a different way. So that's how we became friends. And so when Rebecca bought this wagon, we call it, I was really interested to get involved, and I've had a lot of ideas from the past that I could bring to it. And I've lived on a narrow boat and renovated things. I can make things. So So I was actually very excited to get involved. What you can see in that photograph is the cladding being put on, red cedar cladding, which is from the local woodland from Stour Head, which Paul Hawthorne had already purchased and was there ready, and we cut it up, and basic things like did it go horizontal or vertical, those kind of mundane design issues. The main thing we changed actually is that we changed the position of the door, and we put it in the center over all that kind of like pulling gear, which seems a bit strange, but we thought, well,
It was on the side.
it was on the side before, but where a caravan door might be. But we moved it to the center because then kind of made sense for us spatially, and we're going to build a little veranda which goes over all that towing gear at the front, which otherwise would be kind of a hazard actually.
Made it a more traditional shape.
Yeah, so then I guess, yeah, there it is. It's kind of getting there, isn't it?
They've just frozen for a minute. We'll wait. Rory, I'm gonna let you find out if they can reboot. And we'll take a question in the meantime while we wait, okay?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay,
Sure.
so one of the things that's coming up, and I'm gonna throw this open to Jackson and James, is definitely about land. It seems to be a very pertinent question for folks, mostly around whether with the permission, James, you answered it with basically handling tiny homes as caravans, but there's also this idea of is a park home a caravan? And also the UK planning regime, would it allow for more communities basically to set up as plots?
Okay, do you want me to take that first, Prana?
Sure.
Yeah, so the question that's always asked, can I buy a piece of land and put a caravan on it and live in it instead of building a house, or is that a loophole? It's not, because although a caravan in law is not a building, and arguably a tiny home isn't as well, it's a possession which can be moved. If you live in a caravan or a tiny home on a piece of land, you change the use of the land underneath it to residential. So you're immediately caught by the same planning restrictions as if you built a house. You'd just be in a bit more trouble if you built a house because you'd also built something. So there is no loophole. And therefore, the question of whether there is a particular place for tiny homes yet in the understanding of the British planning system is basically no. But it does understand caravan sites, and remember that caravan sites are also, there's not just holiday parks, there's some residential ones. They have a somewhat low rent image, but there is the opportunity to use that piece of legislation, whereas those sites are licensed for tiny home purposes. My ultimate recommendation, as I said, would be to keep tiny homes as caravan compliant as possible. The three tests of the size that I mentioned, that it's movable, you can pick it up without it breaking, but you don't have to be able to move it on the road. So clearly that size would be impossible. And if it's made in two halves, it's one of the big ones. The last act of putting it on site is to join the two halves together. They're the three tests of a caravan. If you Google planning definition caravan, you'll find loads on the internet. So ultimately, there is no convenient landing place for the notion of a tiny home community yet. There are just things which are similar enough that we might get some traction there. But I would also advise, the really good things we've heard about today, the benefits of alternative and smaller housing, the possibility to manage a whole site and share facilities, they're all good news stories. So to package a narrative about what a tiny home community is, and I know that Exeter and Bristol are working with you to do that. I think is quite important right now, but just give enough familiarity for planners where that's possible.
Thank you. Anything to add, Jackson?
Yeah, okay. Well, I've almost got a question to throw back at James, but there's two kind of, well, there was one clear, easier win, which is you find a site that's already in a within the boundary of an existing village or town or city, because planning rules are very different to if you're outside of that boundary, as James mentioned earlier. So if you can find, finding a plot somewhere like that, then that's going to be more helpful. There is one other route, and I was going to throw this at James as maybe to respond to, which is the exception site rules, which if you are outside a village or town boundary and you could get exception site rules to support an affordable housing project, but then if it was done as a caravan scheme, so you sort of merged a number of different kind of concepts there, that might be one route that you could get planning, but then there'd probably be a local connection test. So relating to you might need to be then for residents who already live in or around that village or town. Anyway, it is one of the biggest questions, and it's not resolved, and it's been going around the community-led housing sector for the last 20 years, I think. So yeah, good question. Let's find some solutions.
Yes, thank you. And I see that Rebecca has reappeared.
Yes, I think hopefully she should be able to join again now. I think she just had some internet problems.
Great. Okay, so we'll carry on with her.
I'll pass back to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Yes, really sorry about that. Internet went down. I'm not quite sure how much of that was lost, but yeah. So you can see, yeah, the intricacy of the design. I mean, it's been the kind of project that's had the backdrop, obviously, of a kind of lockdown and all the eventualities of that we've all been affected by. So, I think this sort of question about why you set out to do something and how you change in the process of making that thing, any work of art, any creative act, it changes you as a person, the kind of interaction with those materials, and what you set out to do, changes as it goes along. And it really is a journey I would encourage anyone to go on, but it's certainly not for the faint-hearted. But with huge rewards. I mean, you can see from those photos. Is the third slide available there, Rory, where you can, yeah, so you can see the kind of, it's not actually completely finished yet, but we had a go at sprucing it up for these photos at the end of last week. There's still quite a lot of work to do on the interior, but the exterior is there. It's a beautiful object, and yeah, it's a lovely space to be in. The issue around the land and where it's going to be located is yet to be resolved, and yeah, that is part of why I'm sort of involved and interested in this endeavour, because I think something around this way of living has certainly been something that's kind of traditionally been pushed to the edges of our culture, and it's something that more and more people are becoming interested in the kind of mainstream. So I think that is a kind of collective journey that I'm very keen to be a part of in some way, having done this project. And I know Nelly's skills that he's brought to it as well. Yeah, that there we are. This is sort of that this is the result. And I'm very happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any about the more specific sides of it. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, lovely. Well, that's all really interesting stuff. And while you were, Rory, you have something to say about our future?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you both to Rebecca and Neil for that. Really appreciated you telling your story there. That was great. So just before we get into our Q&A, good and properly, we just want to briefly mention about our survey and membership form. Kind of brought up the survey a little bit before, but just wanted to reiterate that after this webinar, you'll be sent a link to both the survey and the membership form. And essentially, if you're interested in our project at all, if you could please fill in the survey. And if you'd also like to become a member, if you could fill in the survey and then fill in the form, that'd be really appreciated. It'll help move our project forward, and yeah, we really appreciate that. Just wanted to mention that. For those of you who are on Facebook Live, we will put a link into our Facebook page for you to follow to access either of these forms if you need to. I'll hand back over to Prana and we can start the Q&A.
Okay, great. So I'm trying to class some of these questions together because there seems to be a general wish to talk about some homelessness and rough sleepers and being engaged for engaging local authorities for social housing need. And I just thought I would group those together. And is that a way to get started with a tiny home community as a preference, or any opinions on that? If everyone can unmute, maybe Jackson, you can address that first.
Well, I think it's interesting, James mentioned earlier that the differences between a tiny house in relation to bringing in the ideas around co-housing. Well, I guess this comes almost back to the direction that the Frome tiny house community want to go in. If it's trying to, which part of the sector is it really trying to address? And it is quite hard to. It's quite hard to just do a project that's just addresses one bit. It's like there's a number of variables that need to come in. There's the finance that needs to come in. There's the expertise. There's the willingness for people to come together and help make something happen. There's the hands-on willingness, and there's finding a site with someone, where that comes from and whether that has to be bought or provided. And all those factors then sort of play into what type of project it is. Rory showed, great image of a small cluster of homes that sort of gave a feel slightly a bit more of a rural setting, which could be done in a way for whether that's helping people who are directly homeless at the moment, or whether that's a project that is helping people who are trying to resize, or maybe they're vulnerable to homelessness. But it also comes back to the budget, where that comes from as well, because if it's all there's quite a number of variables. And I think it will depend on the input by this sort of wider group of people that are present today, whether they come forward and help to unlock some of those challenges, which will then hopefully lead it in a direction that would work.
Yeah, apologies if you're getting some background noise from me. It's one of the challenges of living in a small space is there's nowhere to go on your own and sit doing a Zoom call. I mean, conceptually, I feel it's important that tiny homes communities have a diversity of residents. They don't just become places for people in housing need. They also become a housing choice for other people, because some of the things that Rebecca was saying about you have a different relationship with living in a small space. I also think you have a different relationship with a piece of land. I remember watching on YouTube many years ago a tiny house video from the US where the person on their piece of land was totally disinterested in what she lived in. She had a much stronger relationship with a piece of land as a result of that being her focus and that being focus for her energy. So ideally, I think they are a mix of people who have all willingly wished to live in a different way. There are definitely policy advantages in trying to meet affordable housing needs, both in urban and in rural areas, and Jackson summed them up well. I needn't repeat that. But I think we need to sort of draw the concept of tiny homes as broadly as we can, but be conscious that for the first schemes, which will be pioneers, we need not to be over ambitious and do everything all at once, because the challenge of getting tiny home accepted as a valid entity or concept within the UK is the most important task I see at the moment.
Okay. There seems to be some myths to debunk a little bit, perhaps, about whether a tiny home community would be seen as a slum, or whether it would be for glampers, for, you know, for the other end of the scale on economies. Any ideas, folks, about what might be a good way to address these perceptions that exist right now?
Yes, I can have a go.
Okay.
I think what just that sort of overlaps a little bit with what James is saying, that a combination of people coming together and sharing their experience and skills, as well as their need, with a common idea of being of using the land or housing differently, co-housing, sharing space, sharing things, so that not everyone has to buy as much. The idea is the concept might be completely different to the way that most people live in the UK, and that's one of the challenges of bringing a community together. But there are communities across the UK as well as globally that do this really successfully, and adding the tiny homes element might be the extra challenge. Adding a combination of ways of living on that community is something that we're hoping for in our vision, which is a collection of people who are able to self-build and, you know, be innovative and have maybe the time, energy, perhaps money to put into their own build, combined with people who maybe can't do that and would like to have something pre-built and come together on a static place that isn't portable or isn't movable necessarily. And that would be the ideal, because that would potentially encourage different people to come together and share in a way that isn't very common and would take a while to get used to. But the idea is that it is going to be something that's planned beautifully, and there isn't any way that once we start involving the community with consultation that anyone will have any doubt as to how it's going to end up looking. So if you have in your mind anything like trailer park that you know is associated in the US with something that's really negative, then you know perhaps that's not what we're aiming to look at, but more of a shared experience of mixed dwellings, with a community hub there to do things like shared working and shared growing, and that sort of I think would demonstrate with enough community involvement and engagement that that's really it's not something that's going to be either a locked gated community of just all, you know, lifestyle that's exclusive, or, you know, or indeed something that's just full of you know, random sort of trailer ideas put together. So it really is going to be a well thought out and well planned community by the end.
Okay.
Can I just add to that, Prana? Just one,
Yes,
just one thing,
sure.
just that doing an affordable scheme or financially accessible scheme doesn't mean that all the homes have to be built as a sort of slum type sort of project, and the affordability can come through like a number of different forms. One is having the land retained in community ownership, or in some form, whether there's a community land trust, maybe through the Frome Community Land Trust, or cooperatively owned, or as a community interest company. And so that sort of locks the land price over time. And then there's how it's built, so bringing in residents' involvement into sort of shared you know, sweat equity elements. So some of the residents being hands-on, helping to build, that can help to adjust the price a bit as well. So you can still have a really lovely quality build with and a project where the cost is much lower.
Yeah, and I think there's a planning argument there as well. You know, I totally agree that the way to move away from those images or those perceptions is to propose and build something great, and kind of move the argument along by doing. But there's also a planning argument there that in guaranteeing and showing that it's great but different, you're strengthening your planning argument rather than just opening the invitation to compare it with things from the past.
Yeah. And this is, there are some specific questions that are coming through. For Rory, do you think a family of 4 or 3 could live in a tiny home?
I've seen plenty of examples of different types of tiny homes, and I have seen tiny homes with families of 4. Yeah, two parents, 2 kids. It really depends on what design and style of tiny house you're talking about. But I've seen examples of parent with a couple of parents with 2 small kids doing it. It's not necessarily for the faint-hearted, but it is for some people. And I've even seen an example of someone who built their own tiny house, and they had kids, and they then built a second one for their kids, and they have both of them on site. They can, if they wanted to move house, they can move both of them. So, and that's if we're talking about towable tiny homes. You know, in principle, if it was non-portable, it could be a bit larger and actually much more comfortably home for people, potentially even more, depending on the design, I suppose. I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
And also, aside from the garden, are there any opportunities for work on the site that you are engaging with Jackson with?
Is that relating to the sort of conceptual site
So
plan?
like what's called a live work situation, where there might be workshops, or like in co-housing situations, there might be studios. Yeah.
Yeah, as part of the conceptual site plan, we would like that to be part of the plan for the development, to have shared working spaces, to have like I mean, for example, the Tiny House Community Bristol, their first project kind of proposes quite a few shared buildings that sort of contribute to the economy in some way, in the sense they'll have a shop where they can sort of so they can be selling their own produce and things like that. There's a few different ways that potentially the community, I guess, could engage with the local economy and potentially provide work. Yeah, that's an interesting thing for us to explore. And I think also when it comes to people who want to maybe build their own home but want to be assisted in that process, there's also potentially an opportunity for people to be doing, for people to be learning to build through the process of actually building their own home on the development. These are things that we all sort of have to explore and research more, really. But I suppose, yes, we do want to have some opportunities for people to
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And there's some money questions coming up. Jackson, how much does the snug home cost?
Oh, the big question. I knew it'd be coming up. So the snug that you saw pictures of is slightly out of context, because it's our prototype. So it's our first one, and we've built it over the last year with lots of training and workshops with people. We're aiming to bring, our objective is how can we make an ecological house financially accessible. So that's our primary goal. Like, in a way, it's not at the moment. The one we've just built is we're just kind of finalizing some of the costs at the moment. It's probably come out about 140,000, 150,000. That's for a 44 square meter home. So the price per square meter is very high. Well, it's not very high. It's reasonably high. You know, it is a real home. It's not a tiny house. It meets the space standards, and it's a fixed building. Like, you know, we had £20,000 to connect the services to the street. So things like that, these sort of add-on costs have become, quite a blow. The actual, all the sort of additional consultant costs to get the engineering done, those all sort of add up. So that's probably in the region of 50,000-60,000. So the build itself, and then we've also done, we've used really beautiful larch cladding that's from Maiden Bradley, which is down near Frome, not far from Frome, and that was quite expensive process to put all that on. So we're looking at how can we get the price down and make it accessible, and how can we do maybe one module or 4 modules to deal with it. So yeah, our prototype, each time we're going to try and bring that cost down.
Okay, here's a jackpot question for you as well. You can't get a mortgage for a caravan generally. Is there a way around that? And for a tiny home that you stick to the caravan definition for? Or is there a campaign afoot, perhaps, that is trying to change what a tiny home can be financed by?
Yeah,
So I can speak briefly.
Or to Rory, you answer that.
I wanted to just briefly say that I remember through my experience in the adventure course that I discovered there is a company in the UK, if I'm remembering this off the top of my head correctly, called Pegasus Finance, and they actually specifically say that they help with loans for tiny homes. I don't know if that answers that question, but I just thought I'd mention that in the sense that there are some companies that I guess have got that in their mind. They aren't, that there are some companies that are actually, they're aware of the concept of tiny homes and willing to help, but I don't know a lot about that. I just thought I'd mention that.
Well, I can feel the people Googling right now.
Well, yeah. But I think, Jackson, did you have something to add?
I think there is a sort of a risk that the lenders have when you've got something that's movable, and because you borrow the money, you build it, and then you drag it off and disappear somewhere into the wilderness. I guess there could be some experimentation around talking to some of the big lenders around fixed small buildings. As James mentioned, you don't have to have wheels, but you have to potentially be able to move them. If they were part of a cluster, so rather than individuals having to raise the money, if it was done as a collective, as maybe a land trust or a community, then that might be a route around that. There aren't that many tiny house projects that are community owned that I'm aware of to be able to take that in. So again, this is part of this webinar, is to put the feelers out and find out who's out there that can come and help answer these questions.
Prana, also I think Leo from Navajo is attending the webinar, and he's put his web address in the chat there if anyone wants to go and have a look, because I think they have some financing links. So
Oh, great.
I think that's already just gone up in the chat there. So
Yes.
that was specifically the sort of thing that Rory was talking about, if you want to have an individual tiny home. And we're hoping that obviously our development would be a combination of something that was potentially had one landowner, a different dwelling owner, and then a space for self-build. And so there'd be different layers of financing options envisaged.
Okay. Thank you for that. I didn't spot that, but I can see it now. Yeah. Okay. So for you, Polly, perhaps, how does Frome Town Council embrace these practical solutions, and have these been broached with the Living Spaces panel at Mendip District Council?
Our project is not actively focusing on talks with the council at the moment, although we do have contacts within the council and planning contacts. And I think Richard is here today from Mendip, and maybe Jane from Frome Town Council, who we are in touch with as part of our contacts via Fair Housing for Frome and faculty. So that's part of our networking, and we hope to be able to have more developed meetings with them when our business plan is completed and put into place, and we are hopefully gaining funding. So we'll be going down much more down that route during our land search. That's probably, unless Rory had anything to embellish on that, it's probably he's had more conversation with Frome Town Council than I have.
I think that sums it up at the moment. Yeah.
Okay.
The good thing is that Frome is quite well connected, sort of in terms of the different groups, connecting with the town council and such. So I think it's good that we've got those contacts to lean on, when we need to. But I think you summed it up well.
Okay, I've got a question which is open for everyone, I believe. Can you explain a bit more about your governance structure and how you've made decisions with regards to business planning? I'm intrigued by more cooperative forms of housing, but somewhat wary that adopting a more level organizational structure can lead to problems around decision making. Any comments would be welcome.
So just going back to our original plans about how we want to develop sociocracy and governance. That's something that we as Fair Housing for Frome want to facilitate right from the start of the group forming and ongoing through to the community itself forming. That's not a simple thing to get right, and we don't want the community to fail. So we want to make sure that there's support from Fair Housing for Frome to be able to do that. So that's included in all our grant applications, funding applications, past, present, and future.
Thank you. I just want to check that, are there any questions coming in from Facebook that I might be missing?
Not at the moment, no, actually.
I think they're going straight into the link. Oh, apparently no. Our Facebook
okay.
process.
Right, that's great. Okay, so we have a few more. We have probably time for 2 more questions. I'm sorry if I haven't been able to get to your specific questions. Some of them are quite detailed and drilling down on things like park home standards and what happens with a granny annex and specific locations and things that we probably can't answer here today. But do email us if you have continuing questions after the webinar. Let me just okay. I'd like to see councils release land under the Right to Regenerate Act to local groups, creating basic park home layout infrastructure for community self-build with tiny plots and shared amenities paid back over time via pitch fees. And this relates to another question earlier. In the Frome development, will there be rent and fees on the community site? And what kind of money would that be?
Okay, so the planning one I think is probably more James, that first part. The second part, as I say, we are hoping for a landing on some sort of fair rent model, but to be finalised.
Okay.
Yeah, I think on the right to regenerate and so on, it's a possibility. But again, the task as I see it, which is most important, is to put a good frame around what tiny homes are and what a tiny home community would be in ways that is sufficiently sort of integrated and reassuring. The job of management of an entire site and so on, and shared facilities and how that's all sorted out, as well as the actual homes themselves, it is important, because when one turns to planning, you're giving planning permission for everything. And so the planners, quite rightly, we'd be looking to consent something that gives them all those guarantees, as well as creating the opportunities which we're talking about today.
Can I just add into that as well, which is that councils don't often have lots of land to give away either. So quite often councils are trying to find sites to do projects themselves or as well. So as much as councils can be supportive, I think there's always value in trying to see if there's ways to make it work independently from the council and just get the council support where they can. Though obviously councils with land, it'd be great if they're able to make some sites available. But often councils also have huge financial deficits that they want to use their land to try and address as well. So it's a sort of quite tricky balancing act for councils to do that.
Okay, this is sort of a general question. What area of land do you think you would need for a small home? That's an interesting question. Does anybody have an ideal?
It depends how you define a small home, I suppose, and also, you know, in terms of what you need for the home, it also depends on like whether you have private garden space or shared garden space. So I mean, the idea, that's something we'll be exploring with the ideas towards our community, whether they'll be both private and shared or just shared sort of outdoor space. I suppose if someone wanted an idea in terms of sizes, what James mentioned before about the Caravan Act, but in terms of like a towable tiny home, there's restrictions there to do with road legality, so it'd have to be about 2.5 meters width, 4 meters high, 7 meters long, potentially longer with some restrictions, and outside of that, it kind of really depends on what the design of the home is as to how much space it actually physically takes up. I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I feel like it's a bit of a complex one in a way, depending on the size of the actual design of the dwelling, and then what's on top of that in terms of private garden space versus shared. Helps.
Okay, and our last question will be, I think this one will probably be a good one to end on, is any campaigns about, let me just scroll up again and see if I can find that. No, seems to have disappeared. It was about space standards, campaigns on reforming those space standards that limit the size of how people are living now.
Yeah, I saw that question. The only thing I would add is that I know it's something that the Tiny House Community Bristol group broached with their local council, and it's something I think they're still discussing with them in terms of how to address minimum space standards when it comes to that community.
Do you think it's a
communal
fight?
Shared aspect? Do
you think it's a struggle from one community to another, one local authority to another, or is there a national, is there a way to harness national impetus behind changing the law?
It's a good question, and I don't think I know the answer to that one, but I'll forward that on to James.
Yeah, I mean, I think the national space standards, we have to remember they're there for good reason, particularly with the permitted development regulations allowing the conversion of all sorts of urban buildings to houses. Without the space standards, we could be basically converting to substandard housing without the ability of the planning system to properly look at that. And having national space standards, it's relatively recent as well. They're not mandatory unless they appear as referenced in local authority policy. But whilst in this context, it can be they can be seen as a problem, generally they're a good idea. I think what's needed is encouragement to sort of broaden and extend them into different contexts, things like tiny homes, whereas, you know, the whole notion of a tiny home is that the built envelope in which you live is small, but you have other things available to you which compensate for that. And I think the campaign, if you like, it will only come, in my view, from the promoters of tiny home schemes. And the key there is to work together rather than be divided on that.
That's a great place to end. Thank
Can
you.
I just, sorry, Pam, just
Oh,
one
yeah.
second. I just wanted to add to that James's point is really important, because if you take away those space standards, then you are up for the developers just jumping in on as a solution to delivering smaller spaces. So some sort of caveat that allows community or tiny house groups to deliver where you have that shared facility space is really critical. And often a bigger project can be taken through to the planning committee, and if the planning committee can see the value of a project, then maybe they can overturn it locally, but having it nationally overturned is questionable.
Right. So the trade-off is, you know, give us this opportunity and we'll give something back to the community, essentially. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to have to wrap up now. It's been a really full experience. Thanks again, everybody, for attending, and thank you, presenters, all very much for coming, spending your weekend time with us, and making some really great presentations. If we haven't answered your question, or you need to make a comment that you feel would help, definitely send us an email. Have a great weekend. Remember to please fill out the survey on your way out. Visit our website so that you can see the webinar replay, listen to our Housing Hub on Frome FM, join our newsletter, and we'll keep you posted on what Fair Housing for Frome and tiny homes are doing quite soon. So stay safe and goodbye from us.
Well, so Prana, just to
I'm very sorry.
No, don't worry. Before everyone does leave, if there's anyone who is interested in becoming a member, we've already mentioned about the survey and the membership form, but just want to let you know that we've got a program of future meetings and events. We've got our first session for new members is going to be on Wednesday, 31st of March, in about a week and a half's time. And we've also got another one planned for 2 weeks after that to sort of start forming those working groups. So just want to let you know that those Zoom meetings will be set up. The links will be sent to people who register to become a member. And we've also sort of got some plans in the works in the future of doing an outdoor event in the summer, which would be great. Obviously, it'll be completely dependent on COVID restrictions, among other things. But just wanted to mention that before everyone goes. But thank you so much for everyone, for all the speakers, and for everyone who's attending. Thank you. Yeah, I guess we're all going to say goodbye. Bye.
Thanks very much.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.